On the night of February 20th, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Roxanne Wood went out for an ordinary Friday evening with her husband and never got to finish it. She came home to a small house on Tam-O-Shanter Lane, just south of Niles, Michigan. Her husband, Terry, stopped off to go bowling. He was gone maybe 45 minutes. When he walked through the door, he found Roxanne dead on their own kitchen floor. She had been attacked with a knife pulled from her own kitchen drawer. Nothing was brought to that house to kill her. Whoever did it used what was already there, and then he walked out into the night and disappeared. The Michigan State Police did everything they knew how to do in 1987. They collected the evidence, they looked hard at the people closest to her, and then the case went quiet, the way these cases do, and it stayed quiet for 35 years. Roxanne's father waited, her brother waited, her sister waited. Her husband, wrongly suspected at the start, waited longest of all to be believed. Here's the thing nobody understood back then. The evidence to catch her killer had been sitting in a police storage unit the entire time. 2 small tubes of dried blood. The problem wasn't that the police didn't have it. The problem was that the science to read it hadn't been invented yet. When it finally was, it took a genealogist just 4 days to do what 35 years of detective work couldn't. And the man who'd done it had walked back into free society only months before he killed her. This is the story of how the smallest sample of DNA anyone had ever solved a case with brought Roxanne Wood's killer home. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of forgotten victims who finally got justice. If that matters to you, subscribe. Before we get to that Friday night, you need to know who Roxanne was, because she wasn't just a name in a case file, and she wasn't just a body on a kitchen floor. She was a person, and the people who loved her called her Rock. Roxanne Lee Wood grew up in southwest Michigan in the stretch of small towns that sit right up against the Indiana line. She graduated from Niles High School in 1974. If you knew her, you knew a few things about her right away. She loved flowers, rose bushes especially. She was the kind of woman who put her hands in the dirt in the spring and coaxed things into bloom, who knew what a plant needed and gave it exactly that. And she loved to cook. She loved to bake. Her kitchen wasn't just a room in her house, it was where she did the things that made her happiest. That detail matters, and it's going to sit heavy on this whole story, so hold on to it. The kitchen was Roxanne's place. It was where she made the food she loved making for the people she loved feeding. By the winter of 1987, she was 30 years old and married to Terry Wood. They had that house on Tam-O-Shanter Lane in Niles Township in Berrien County, a quiet residential road just outside the city limits. She had a brother, Brad. She had a sister, Janet. She had a father who, decades later, would still be alive and still be waiting for an answer. This was a close family. The kind where a phone call gets returned. The kind where, when one of them goes silent, the others notice. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She was a homemaker in a small Michigan town who liked her garden and liked her kitchen and liked going out on a Friday night with her husband. That's the whole picture. And it's enough. That's a life. It was hers and it was good, and it had every reason to keep going for another 50 years. On the evening of February 20th, 1987, it didn't. It was a Friday. Roxanne and Terry had been out together that evening, the ordinary end of an ordinary week. At some point, the two of them separated. Roxanne headed home ahead of her husband. Terry went bowling the way he did and told her he wouldn't be long. She let herself into the house on Tam-O-Shanter Lane. She was, as far as anyone can tell, completely alone. What happened next took only minutes. Roxanne was sexually assaulted inside her own home. She was struck over the head, and her throat was cut with a fillet knife taken from her own kitchen. There was no weapon carried in from outside. The killer used what he found in her drawers in the one room in the house that had been hers. A frying pan was found broken at the scene. The knife was never recovered. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken window, no jimmied lock, no splintered door frame. To the investigators who arrived that night, that single fact would point them in exactly the wrong direction, and it would cost a grieving man years of quiet suspicion. Terry came home from bowling about 45 minutes after Roxanne. He walked into his own house and found his wife dead on the kitchen floor in the room she loved most. He was the one who found her. Whatever he did in the next few minutes, he did it as a man whose entire world had just ended. And he did it not knowing that the people coming to help him would spend the next stretch of time wondering if he'd done it himself. The Michigan State Police responded out of the Niles post. They did what you do at a homicide scene. They photographed it, they measured it, they bagged what could be bagged. And in 1987, at that scene, they collected the things that would matter more than anyone in that room could possibly have known. They collected semen. They collected blood. There was a bloodstain on the back door. There was the broken frying pan. There was the biological evidence left behind by whoever had attacked her, evidence the killer couldn't have known he was leaving. The technicians preserved that biological material the best way they knew how in 1987. It went into storage as 2 tubes of dried blood. 2 small tubes. That was the whole ballgame, though nobody could have told you so at the time. Everything about who finally answered for Roxanne Wood's murder 35 years later came down to what was inside those 2 tubes. And for most of those 35 years, they were useless. Not because they were empty, because the world hadn't built the machine that could read them yet. That's the cruel center of this case, and it's worth saying plainly before we go any further. The evidence existed the entire time, from the first night. The name of the killer was written, in a sense, in those 2 tubes the whole way through. What didn't exist yet was the chemistry to turn that trace of degraded blood into a name. So the tubes sat, and Roxanne's family waited, and the man who killed her went on living his life a few miles down the road, across the state line, as if nothing had happened at all. In those first days and weeks, the Michigan State Police worked the case the way any homicide gets worked. They canvassed the neighborhood, they built a timeline of Roxanne's last evening, and they kept circling back to that one stubborn detail from the scene, the fact that there was no forced entry, no window broken, no door forced. To an investigator, that fact tends to say something specific. It tends to say the victim knew the person who came in. It tends to say she opened the door herself, or that the door was already open to someone who belonged there. And the person who belonged there, in the eyes of 1987, was her husband. So they looked at Terry Wood. They looked at the man who'd come home from bowling and found her. They looked at how he acted in those first raw hours, at the phone calls, at the things a man does when he's just walked into the worst moment of his life, and nobody has taught him how he's supposed to behave. There was no manual for Terry. There was just his dead wife and a house full of police officers who were quietly asking themselves whether the grieving husband was actually the killer. He wasn't. And here's what needs to be said plainly. Because Terry Wood carried this for decades, the evidence that was collected that night, the biological material left by the man who assaulted Roxanne, did not belong to Terry. When the science finally arrived to test it, it excluded him completely. He was never charged. He was never the man. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a husband who lost his wife on an ordinary Friday and then had to live under a shadow that wasn't his fault and wasn't fair. But in 1987, the science that would clear him and convict someone else didn't exist. So the investigation had a scene, it had evidence, it had a grieving husband it couldn't make a case against, and it had 2 tubes of dried blood that no lab on earth could yet turn into a name. One by one, the leads ran out. The canvas produced nothing that stuck. The timeline had a window in it that no witness could fill. And slowly, the way it always happens, the phone stopped ringing with new information, and the file got thicker with dead ends, and Roxanne Wood's murder went cold. Understand what that word means here, because it isn't a story about lazy police or a botched scene. Nobody lost the evidence. Nobody contaminated it. The Michigan State Police did the one thing that would matter most 35 years later. They kept it. They held on to those 2 tubes of dried blood and the frying pan and the record of that back door stain, and they held on to them correctly through decades of moves and storage and personnel turning over. The chain of custody never broke. That's the quiet heroism at the front of this story. The people in 1987 couldn't solve it, but they refused to throw it away, and they preserved it well enough that someone else could finish the job. The years went by. Reagan left office. The house on Tam-O-Shanter Lane changed. The world moved from cassette tapes to compact discs to the early internet, and Roxanne's family aged into a grief that had no destination. There was no trial to attend, no verdict to hear, no one to look at across a courtroom, just an anniversary every February, and a garden somewhere that a woman who loved rose bushes wasn't there to tend, and a father who kept waking up in a world where the man who killed his daughter had never answered for it. In 2001, the Michigan State Police pulled the file back out. 14 years had passed. DNA testing existed now in a way it hadn't in 1987. Detectives who reopen a cold case in 2001 are betting that the science has caught up to the evidence, and for a lot of cases from the 80s, it finally had. Investigators all over the country were pulling old rape kits and old blood samples out of storage and running them through CODIS, the national DNA database that had come online in the 90s, watching for a hit. But Roxanne's evidence had a problem the technology of 2001 still couldn't beat. The sample was too small, it was too degraded. The standard DNA testing of the era, the kind that feeds a profile into CODIS, needs a certain amount of reasonably intact material to work with. Roxanne's 2 tubes of dried blood didn't have it. Whatever the killer had left behind in 1987 had spent 14 more years breaking down at the molecular level, and there simply wasn't enough of it, in good enough shape, to produce the kind of profile the system needed. So 2001 came and went with no break. The case went back into storage, and the wait, which had already lasted longer than anyone should have to bear, kept going. Almost 20 more years passed. Then, in 2020, the Michigan State Police reopened the Roxanne Wood case one more time, 33 years after that Friday night. And this time, they did something different. They didn't just pull the evidence and hope the lab could read it. They went looking for help with the mountain of paper the case had become, and they found it at Western Michigan University in a program built for exactly this kind of forgotten file. Western Michigan University runs a cold case program directed by Dr. Ashlyn Kirsten. It's a program where students, real undergraduates, take on real unsolved homicides and do the grinding, unglamorous work that a decades-old case demands before anyone can even think about a breakthrough. And the Roxanne Wood file was exactly the kind of thing they took on. By 2020, it was 33 years of accumulated paper, reports, interviews, notes, photographs, tips, the whole sprawling archive of an investigation that had been picked up and put down across 3 different decades. The students took all of it and turned it into something a modern investigation could actually use. They digitized the file. They built it into a searchable database. Where a detective in 1987 or 2001 would have had to physically dig through boxes, hoping to remember which folder held which interview, the WMU students created indus and relationship webs, big posters mapping out who knew whom, who was where, how every name in the case connected to every other name. They logged roughly 1,200 hours of work over about 8 months. Think about that. 1,200 hours of college students sitting with the darkest Friday night in a stranger's life, scanning and sorting and cross-referencing so that when the science finally came through, no one would have to waste a single day hunting for a piece of paper. That organizational work is easy to skip past, but it's one of the reasons this case moved fast at the end. When the DNA breakthrough finally came, the investigators weren't starting cold. They had a fully searchable, fully mapped file at their fingertips, built by students who'd never met Roxanne Wood and who cared about her anyway. And in that same year, 2020, with the file finally organized, the Michigan State Police made the decision that broke the case open. They took those 2 tubes of dried blood, the evidence that CODIS couldn't read in 2001 and couldn't have dreamed of reading in 1987, and they sent them to a laboratory in California that specialized in doing the impossible with almost nothing. A company called Identifinders International, run by a scientist named Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick isn't a traditional forensic scientist by training. She came out of nuclear physics before she turned her mind to DNA, and Identifinders had made its name doing the cases other labs handed back. If a sample was too small, too old, too broken down for a normal laboratory to bother with, that was precisely the kind of thing that landed on Fitzpatrick's bench. Roxanne's evidence was, even by that standard, extraordinary. Because here is what 34 years had left them with. The biological material that came out of those two tubes had degraded down to about 3% of the amount a lab normally uses to build a DNA profile. 3%. Fitzpatrick described it in words that stick with you. She called it a gnat's eyebrow of DNA, about 3% of what we normally use. Identifinders would go on to say it was the lowest amount of DNA they had ever worked with to solve a case. Not one of the lowest they'd ever seen. This wasn't a case where the answer was sitting there waiting to be printed out. This was a case where the material was so close to nothing that most of the field would have called it unworkable and closed the folder. If this case is getting under your skin the way it should, subscribe. So what did Identifinders actually do with a gnat's eyebrow of DNA? This is the part of the story that changed everything, and it's worth understanding, because it's the reason a 35-year-old murder could ever be solved at all. There are two different jobs hidden inside that word, DNA, and people tend to blur them together. The first job is chemistry. It happens in a lab with machines and reagents and a scientist working at the very edge of what physics allows. The second job is genealogy. It happens on a computer with family trees and public records and a researcher thinking like a detective. Roxanne's case needed both, and almost all of the 35-year miracle came down to the first one being hard. The kind of DNA testing that feeds CODIS, the national database, is called STR typing. It reads a handful of specific markers, and it's fast and reliable when you have a decent sample. But it has a fatal limitation for a case like this. If the DNA isn't in the database already, if your killer has never been entered into CODIS, then a perfect STR profile matches nothing. It just sits there. And even beyond that, STR typing needs more and better material than Roxanne's evidence had left to give. So Identifinders went a different way. They built what's called an SNP profile. Instead of reading a handful of markers, an SNP profile reads hundreds of thousands of points across the genome, the same kind of data that consumer companies generate when someone spits in a tube to find out where their ancestors came from. That kind of profile can be compared not just against known criminals, but against ordinary people who've uploaded their own DNA to public genealogy databases. It doesn't find your suspect, it finds your suspect's cousins. But building an SNP profile from 3% of a normal, intact sample from material that had been drying and breaking apart for 34 years was brutally, painfully slow. Identifinders spent roughly 10 months on the chemistry alone, 10 months coaxing a readable profile out of almost nothing, working and reworking a sample that gave them almost no margin for error, because if they burned through it and failed, there was no more. That's the part of this case that took the decades, not the family tree. The family tree, when it finally came, took days. The 35-year wait was the wait for enough readable DNA to even begin. Fitzpatrick put it simply. She said this case was the toughest technical challenge they had faced, but it shows that we should never give up hope. When the profile was finally ready, it went to a genetic genealogist named Gabriela Vargas, an investigative genetic genealogist working as an independent consultant for Identifinders. And what happened next is almost hard to believe after everything that came before it. Vargas took the finished profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a public database, a place where ordinary people voluntarily upload the DNA results they got from consumer testing kits, usually because they want to find relatives or fill in their own family history. When a crime scene profile goes into a database like that, it doesn't come back with the killer's name. It comes back with a list of people who share DNA with him, distant cousins mostly, strangers to the case who happen to sit somewhere on the same family tree as the man who killed Roxanne Wood. And from those matches, Vargas did what investigative genetic genealogists do. She built the tree. She worked from the distant relatives the database gave her, and she reconstructed the family, generation by generation, reportedly tracing the lines all the way back to 1797. She followed the branches forward through 2 centuries of births and marriages and deaths, narrowing and narrowing until the whole sprawling tree came down to a single couple and their 3 sons, 3 men. One of them had left his DNA on Roxanne Wood in 1987. Vargas didn't have to guess between them for long. 2 of the 3 sons could be placed somewhere else in 1987, ruled out by where they were living when Roxanne was killed. That left the 3rd son, a man who, in 1987, had been living just a few miles from the Wood home, right across the state line. A man with a documented history of sexual assault. His name was Patrick Wayne Gilham. The whole genealogy, the part that finally put a name to 35 years of silence, took Gabriela Vargas 4 days. She said it herself, and the line is the whole case in a single sentence. Literally, a case that took them 34 years to investigate took me 4 days to solve. 4 days. Not because she was smarter than every detective who'd come before her, but because she was the first person in the entire history of the case who finally had a readable profile in her hands to start from. But a family tree, no matter how carefully built, isn't proof. Naming Patrick Wayne Gilham as the likely source of the DNA was the beginning of the real police work, not the end of it. Investigators now had a suspect. What they needed was his actual DNA, taken directly, to compare against the crime scene profile and prove the match beyond any argument a defense attorney could make. And they needed to get it without tipping him off. By the spring of 2021, investigators had settled on Patrick Wayne Gilham, and he wasn't in Michigan anymore. He was living across the state line in South Bend, Indiana, the same area he'd lived in back in 1987, only a few miles from the house on Tam-O-Shanter Lane. He had been there, essentially, the whole time. While Roxanne's family aged and her father kept waiting, the man the tree pointed to had been living out an ordinary life a short drive away, on the other side of a state border that had helped keep him invisible. So the Michigan State Police did what you do when you have a suspect, but not yet the proof. Around May of 2021, they put him under surveillance. They watched him, they followed his routine, and they waited for the one thing that would let them get his DNA without a warrant and without a word to him. They waited for him to throw something away, because there's a legal principle that matters here. When you discard something in public, a coffee cup, a napkin, a cigarette, you give up your expectation of privacy in it. Police don't need a warrant to pick up what you've thrown in the trash or dropped on the sidewalk. And Patrick Gilham was a smoker. For investigators, that was a gift, because a cigarette carries a beautiful amount of saliva, and saliva carries DNA. On June 3, 2021, it happened. Gilham was outside a laundromat, and he finished a cigarette, and he dropped the butt and walked away from it, the way a smoker does 100 times a year without a second thought. An undercover Michigan State trooper was right there. The trooper recovered the discarded cigarette butt off the ground outside that laundromat and bagged it. Gilham never knew. He'd just handed the state of Michigan a direct sample of his own DNA, freely and legally, and he had no idea he'd done it. They sent the cigarette butt to the lab and compared his DNA to the profile pulled from the crime scene, the profile Identifinders had fought for 10 months to build out of almost nothing. It matched. And it didn't match a little. The reported strength of the match was 1 in 958.8 trillion. That's not a number that leaves room for argument. There are only about 8 billion people alive on the entire planet. A figure like that doesn't say Patrick Gilham is probably the man. It says there is no one else. The gnat's eyebrow of DNA left on Roxanne Wood in 1987 belonged to Patrick Wayne Gilham, and now they could prove it in a way no defense attorney could touch. On February 17, 2022, they arrested him in South Bend, Indiana. 35 years after Roxanne died. Just days shy of the anniversary of that Friday night, Patrick Gilham was 67 years old when the handcuffs went on, which means he'd been around 32 when he killed her. He had lived 35 years that Roxanne never got. He'd grown from a young man into an old one. And the entire time, the answer to what he'd done had been sitting in 2 tubes of dried blood in a police storage unit, waiting for the science to catch up to his crime. And then there was the part of Patrick Gilham's history that turns this from a tragedy into something closer to an indictment, because Roxanne Wood was not the first woman he attacked. In 1980, 7 years before that Friday night, Gilham had entered a woman's home and sexually assaulted her. That woman survived. She fought, she lived, and she became the key witness against him. And on the strength of her testimony, Patrick Gilham was convicted of rape. He was supposed to be in prison. He should have been in prison in February of 1987. Instead, he'd been released early. And not by years. He'd been let out, reportedly, only about 4 months before he walked into Roxanne Wood's home and killed her. 4 months. A woman had already survived him and testified against him and put him behind bars for exactly this, and the system let him back out into the world in time to take Roxanne's life. Sit with that, because her family has had to. The man who murdered Roxanne was a known, convicted sexual predator who was free only because someone decided he'd served enough. Once he was arrested, the case against Patrick Gilham moved with none of the delay that had defined the previous 35 years. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match was astronomical. And on March the 18th, 2022, in Berrien County, the county where Niles sits, Patrick Wayne Gilham entered a plea. He pleaded no contest to second-degree murder. It's worth being precise about what a no-contest plea is, because it isn't quite a confession. When a defendant pleads no contest, he doesn't stand up and admit he did it. What he does is decline to fight the charge. He accepts the conviction and accepts the punishment exactly as if he'd been found guilty, but without saying the words. In practical terms, for Roxanne's family, it meant a conviction and a sentence without the ordeal of a full trial. Gilham's attorney offered an explanation for why his client wasn't admitting the details outright, attributing Gilham's claimed lack of memory of the crime to decades of drug use. Whether you believe that or not, the plea did what it needed to do. It made Patrick Gilham a convicted murderer. The sentencing came a little over a month later, on April 25, 2022, in a Berrien County courtroom. And it was there, finally, after 35 years, that the people who loved Roxanne Wood got to stand up and speak. Roxanne's sister, Janet Wood, stood up in that courtroom and put 35 years into a single sentence. His actions gave all of us a life sentence, she said, while he got to live most of his as a free man. That's the whole arithmetic of this case from the family side. Patrick Gilham took 1 life on that Friday night, but the sentence for it fell on everyone who loved Roxanne, and they'd been serving it day after day ever since. He'd gone to work and gone home and smoked his cigarettes and grown old. They had gone to funerals without her and birthdays without her and Februaries without her, over and over for 3.5 decades. And then Roxanne's brother, Brad Wood, spoke. And he said the thing that turns this whole story from grief toward something like grace. "I'm so thankful," he said, "that our 89-year-old father is able to be here to see this man finally pay for what he's done to her." 89 years old. Roxanne's father had been alive when she was born, alive when she was killed, and alive still, at 89, to sit in a Berrien County courtroom and watch the man who took his daughter stand up and answer for it. So many families in these cases don't get that. So many parents go to their graves never knowing. Roxanne's father didn't. He lived long enough. He was in the room. Patrick Gilham was given his chance to speak too, and he took it. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to tell her that I'm very sorry. I can't believe I did what I did. It was, in its way, the closest thing to an admission the family would get from a man who had pleaded no contest rather than say the words outright. Whether it brought them anything, only they can say." Then, the court handed down the sentence. Patrick Wayne Gilham was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years and a maximum of 50 years in prison. And here the truth has to be told plainly, because it matters and because Roxanne's family knows it better than anyone. That is not a life sentence. Gilham was 67 years old at sentencing. A 23-year minimum is a finite number, not a promise that he'll die behind bars. It's a real punishment, a serious one, but it isn't everything, and no one should pretend it is. The man got a defined term for a murder he committed in the prime of his life after already being convicted once of raping another woman. Janet Wood's words hang over the number. He got to live most of his life as a free man. The sentence, whatever it is, can't give any of that time back. Patrick Gilham was sent to serve that term in the Michigan prison system, held at the Carson City Correctional Facility. That's where the man who killed Roxanne Wood went 35 years after he did it, still alive, still breathing, which is more than can be said for the woman he attacked in her own kitchen. But the sentence isn't really where the meaning of this case lives, and the family would tell you that themselves. The meaning lives in how he was caught and in who caught him. Because the people who finally cornered Patrick Gilham weren't a squad of veteran homicide detectives working a fresh lead. The people who broke this case were a group of college students with a scanner and a database, and a genealogist with a family tree, and a lab full of scientists who refused to give up on 3% of a sample. Think about the chain of hands this passed through. A Michigan State Police evidence room that held onto 2 tubes of dried blood for 35 years and never let the chain of custody break. Undergraduates at Western Michigan University who gave 1,200 hours to a stranger's murder, turning 3 decades of chaos into something searchable. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick and her team at Identifinders, who spent 10 months pulling a readable profile out of the smallest quantity of DNA they'd ever solved a case with. Gabriela Vargas, who took that profile and built 2 centuries of a family tree in 4 days. And an undercover trooper who stood outside a laundromat and picked up a cigarette butt off the ground. Not one of those people could have done it alone. Every single link had to hold across 35 years, or Patrick Gilham dies a free man. Some of those Western Michigan University students went to Gilham's sentencing. They sat in the courtroom and watched the end of the case they'd helped rescue from a storage box. They'd never met Roxanne Wood. She'd been dead for years before most of them were even born. And they cared about her anyway, cared enough to give their hours to her, and they were there to see it land. What Identifinders had done wasn't only justice for one family. It was a proof of concept for every family still waiting. The lab had gone public with what this case represented, the lowest quantity of DNA they had ever used to solve a homicide, roughly 3% of a normal sample. And the message inside that number was enormous. It meant that cases everyone had written off, cases where the evidence was thought to be too small, too old, too far gone to ever be tested, might not be hopeless after all. Every cold case detective in the country who'd ever looked at a degraded sample and sighed now had a reason to look again. The bar for what counts as workable evidence had just been lowered dramatically on the strength of what happened to Roxanne Wood. The case drew national attention. CBS told the story on 48 Hours in an episode they called The Unsolvable Murder of Roxanne Wood. And the word unsolvable is doing a lot of work in that title, because for 35 years that's exactly what it was. Until the science moved, and the students scanned, and the genealogist built her tree, and a discarded cigarette closed the distance between a name on a family chart and a man in a courtroom. For one man in particular, the ending of this case carried a weight almost no one else could feel. Terry Wood. Remember what Terry had carried? He was the husband who came home from bowling and found his wife on their kitchen floor. And then, in the days after, he was the man the investigation quietly circled, the one whose grief was studied for signs of guilt, whose every reaction was weighed because there'd been no forced entry and someone had to be looked at first. He hadn't just lost Roxanne. He'd lost her and then had to live under the suspicion of the very people who were supposed to be finding her killer. For years, some part of the world wondered about Terry Wood. The DNA that convicted Patrick Gilham did something for Terry that no apology ever could have. It didn't just name the guilty man, it closed the door, completely and permanently, on the innocent one. The biological evidence from that Friday night had never been Terry's. When the science finally spoke, it spoke his innocence as loudly as it spoke Gilham's guilt. The one in 958.8 trillion that pointed at Patrick Gilham pointed away from Terry with exactly the same certainty. And Terry lived to hear it. That's the part that matters. He didn't die a suspect. He didn't go to his grave with a question mark still hanging over his name in some corner of the county. He lived to see the arrest. He lived to see Patrick Gilham stand in a Berrien County courtroom and plead. He lived to see the sentence come down. At those hearings, Terry was there, and he was described as emotional, as a man finally, after 35 years, allowed to set down something he'd been carrying since he was a young husband. Vindicated is the word. Not happy because there's no happiness at the bottom of a story like this, but vindicated, believed, free of it at last. The same was true in its own way for all of them. For Brad, for Janet, for the father who was 89 and still standing. There's a particular cruelty that these cases usually carry, where the people who most needed the answer are gone before it comes. Parents who spend 20, 30 years calling detectives and then die in the silence. Roxanne's family was spared that specific grief. Not one of the people closest to her had to leave this world without knowing. Her father outlasted the wait. Her brother and sister got to stand up and speak. Her husband got to be believed. The whole immediate family that had loved Rock, the woman who grew rose bushes and baked in the kitchen where she died, was still there to watch the man who took her from them answer for it. In a story with so little mercy in it, that was the mercy. They all lived to see it. And the man responsible had, in a sense, been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Not on the run, not in another country. Just across a state line, a few miles down the road, living in the same South Bend area he'd lived in when he did it. He'd raised no alarm because the one thing that could identify him, his own DNA, couldn't be read by anyone for 34 years. He'd counted, whether he knew it or not, on the limits of science. He'd counted on a gnat's eyebrow of blood being too small to ever betray him. For most of his life, he was right. And then, one day, he wasn't. To understand how a man could kill Roxanne Wood and then live out 3.5 decades a short drive away, you have to understand the ground this happened on. Niles sits in the far southwest corner of Michigan, in Berrien County, right down at the bottom of the state where Michigan runs out and Indiana begins. The line isn't some remote frontier. It's a road you cross without thinking about it. South Bend, Indiana, where Patrick Gilham lived in 1987 and where he was still living when the handcuffs finally came out in 2022, sits just on the other side of that border, only a handful of miles from the house on Tam-O-Shanter Lane. In the life of an ordinary person, that state line means nothing. You cross it to shop, to work, to bowl. In the life of a 1987 homicide investigation, that line meant a great deal. Because in February of 1987, there was no system quietly connecting a murder scene in Niles Township, Michigan, to a convicted rapist recently let out of custody a few miles south in Indiana. The tools that do that now, the national databases that let a detective in one state pull on a thread that leads into another, were years from existing. A killer who lived across a state line in 1987 wasn't hiding exactly. He just fell into the gap between jurisdictions, into the space where one agency's paperwork stopped and another's began. Gilham didn't have to flee to Canada or vanish under a new name. He only had to stay where he was, on the far side of a border that the science of the day couldn't see across. And so he did. For 35 years, the distance between the crime scene and the man who made it was small enough to drive in 20 minutes and vast enough that nobody closed it. It was winter when it happened. The dead middle of a southwest Michigan February, the kind of cold that empties the streets of a small town after dark and keeps people indoors in their kitchens with the lights on and the stove going. That's the season Roxanne died in, the season she'd have been baking through, the flowers she loved months away from breaking ground. A Friday night out in that part of Michigan in February isn't a lavish thing. It's a modest, ordinary pleasure carved out of a long, cold week, a couple going out together and coming home to a warm house. That's all it was meant to be. And the world that investigation lived in was, technologically, a different planet from the one that finally solved it. In 1987, a homicide detective's certainty came from the things a human being could see and gather and connect. Where a door was locked or wasn't, who a victim knew, what a canvas turned up on a cold street. The idea that a trace of biological material, too small to matter, could one day be read like a book and traced through a stranger's distant cousins to a name and an address would have sounded like fiction to the people standing in Roxanne's kitchen that night. They collected the evidence carefully anyway. They preserved it correctly anyway. They did it on faith, really, banking what they had against a future they couldn't picture, a future where a scientist would look at 3% of a ruined sample and see a solvable case. The gap between those two worlds is the whole length of Roxanne's story. On one end, a Michigan State Police evidence room in 1987, holding 2 tubes of dried blood it had no way to read. On the other end, a California laboratory and a genealogist's family tree, and an undercover trooper bending down outside a laundromat. Everything that had to happen in between happened not because anyone finally worked harder, but because the ground itself shifted, because the science crossed a line that Patrick Gilham, all those years, had been living safely on the wrong side of. 35 years. That's how long the answer sat in 2 small tubes of dried blood, waiting for the world to build a way to read it. Roxanne Wood loved her rose bushes and loved her kitchen, and on an ordinary Friday night, she came home to a warm house and never got to grow old. For most of her family's lifetime, the man who took her from them lived a 20-minute drive away, on the safe side of a line the science couldn't cross. And then it could. It wasn't a detective's hunch that finally reached him. It was college students who gave 1,200 hours to a stranger, a lab that refused to give up on 3% of a sample, a genealogist who built 2 centuries of a family tree in 4 days, and a trooper who picked a cigarette off the ground. Every hand had to hold, or Patrick Gilham dies free. They held. Her father lived to see it at 89. Her husband lived to be believed. Justice for Roxanne arrived late, so terribly late, but it arrived. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to know these cases can still be solved. Subscribe, and Roxanne Wood stays remembered for who she was, a woman who grew flowers and fed the people she loved, not just for how her story ended.